Djyuan, Tatro, and Jessica Neptune. Welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Obviously, I want to start off by saying that I watched the documentary twice. I once when it came out, and then most recently in preparation for this conversation. And I found myself obviously inspired multiple times. I'm not embarrassed to say I had tears in my eyes. Um, do you find that this is a common reaction to the documentary and to the project that you guys have going on for you?
Dyjuan, you should take that.
I'm trying to think how best to answer the question. I think that, or maybe rather than speak to it being a common reaction, maybe I should try to articulate why people have that type of reaction. And so I think that most of what we see in popular media, in the news, reading the newspaper about incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people is derogatory, is stereotypical, is degrading. In the power of this film, and it is a narrative changing film, is that it pushes back against those stereotypes, against those caricatures in a very, very profound and articulate and intelligent and human way. And I think because that pushback, that counter is so profound, people have a very strong reaction to the film. The film literally, in the way you experience myself and my classmates and BPI alumni in the film, runs counter and flies in the face of what people tend to think and believe about people like me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that while watching the documentary, what I liked is the fact that they didn't bring up the crimes that got you to the place you got until whether it was the second or third episode, because it first got the viewer acclimated with the program and with the human side of what you and your classmates have gone through, which was, I think, a very good move on the part of the documentary. So to provide some context for the viewers, can you provide a kind of a brief outline of the BPI program? What is it? Is it the first of its kind, and are there programs similar to it around the country?
I'll take that, and then Dyjuan, jump in when you want to. So BPI, the Bard Prison Initiative, very simply is Bard College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley area, in a unit of Bard College, bringing Bard College to other locations. And so we are in 6 prisons, both men's and women's, medium and maximum security, doing associate's and bachelor's degrees for over 300 full-time, fully enrolled Bard students who are in prison. And we've been doing that we're doing that at the same level of rigor and the same curriculum that exists on the main campus, the same syllabi, many of the same faculty, the same kinds of expectations. And we've been doing that for 20 years. And we started because a group of undergraduates in the late 1990s, myself included, and Max Kenner, the founder of BPI as well, and many other students, began to realize This was in the era, the height of tough on crime politics, and sort of law and order politics. And many of us saw in our own families and our own neighborhoods and communities what we now call mass incarceration, and began to really see it as the social justice issue of our era, and asking ourselves what we could do about it. And there were lots of ways in which we started to get involved with movements around mass incarceration at that time. But one of the most important things that Max and others did was find ways to get into the prisons that surrounded us in the Hudson Valley area, and quickly came to the realization that one of the most impactful things we could be doing as undergraduates was to begin to get the college to bring the same education that we were experiencing on the main campus into those prisons. And part of the reason that became so obvious to us as the thing to do was because many of the men that we met in prison at that time remembered an earlier era, not that many years before, where college had been relatively common in prisons across the country and had actually been in every prison in New York State. And with the removal of federal and then state funding, public funding for college and prison programs shuttered nearly overnight. And so they remembered what it was like to have college opportunity in the days before Pell was taken away through the 1994 crime bill, and TAP in New York State taken away the following year by Governor Pataki in the New York State legislature. And they remembered what it meant to have it removed. And so through that connection with people who had been directly impacted and remembered what college had been like and what it had meant, and also our own personal experiences. And I'll speak for myself on this, but I was not alone in this. Understanding ourselves, the value and the preciousness of what we were able to have as undergraduate students. So neither of my parents had gone to college, and I was very aware, being a student, of the ways the world was opening up to me. And so it spoke to me quite deeply on a personal level to have had family members that had been to prison, to have had experiences myself, knowing the value of what education was going to mean for my life trajectory, to put those two pieces together and think about ways that we could be expanding opportunity for college. And so it's not a new thing. We were not the first by any measure, but we did emerge in this moment in which there were very, very few programs across the country. It was really, the whole field was decimated after the removal of public funding, and partly, saw ourselves as having a mission of creating, keeping alive the memory of what this field was and could be and should be. And through the past 20 years have seen more and more colleges and universities around the country coming to the realization that they too should be doing this work. So we are now far from alone in doing the work, and are very proud to have existed through the really lean times where this was highly unpopular, and now very excited to help shape the field as it's become a much more popular thing to do.
Yeah. So what was the reasoning behind taking away the funding for programs like this? I understand being tough on crime, but was it not successful? Was there any rationale?
So tough on crime was the rationale. One of the things that's really important to remember about that era and about the politics that defined all of the sort of legislative and policy initiatives that created mass incarceration, right? We had a skyrocketing incarceration rate, and that was all because of changes in law and policy that put more and more people in prison for longer periods of time. And the drive and the rationale behind all of that kind of punitive politics was always based in the sort of combination of bigotry and anti-Black racism that has long existed, but was in that moment coming out of a response to all of the civil rights gains of the 1960s. And so we're talking about this is legislation and laws starting in the 1970s. So a punitive sort of backlash in that sense. But at the same time, a total disregard for what you're pointing to, sort of interest in what does the greatest good, where the public utility is, and really being about punishment for punishment's sake. There was a real turn in seeing the prison as being solely there to punish. And so for college and prison in particular, what that meant is that even as all the evidence was there to understand the value in terms of whether you put it in terms of recidivism or you put it in sort of other kinds of investments in people, all of that knowledge was there. Everyone understood the value of it. Wardens and prison officials came to Washington, D.C. to say, please don't do this. But it wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about money, frankly. It wasn't about cost saving. It was purely punitive. It was purely rooted in a sort of, I think of it as people talk about, sort of need sort of, the bleeding heart liberal, right? But this is actually very emotionally driven in what we do to people we don't like, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And again, in the documentary, what's very evident is you see a lot of the inmates that go through this program, they took one wrong turn in their lives, and especially when they were young, so 15, 16, whatever got them into prison. But a lot of them had this love for education that preceded prison. So all they were looking for in some ways, I mean, this is from me looking at the program from the outside, obviously, not being inside, was that they were looking for an opportunity to make something of themselves and kind of amend some of the mistakes they made. Djyuan, can you tell the listeners a little bit about your story and how BPI kind of changed your life?
Okay, so thank you, Stanley, and I can do that. But first, I want to take a moment to reframe three parts of that question, right? And so one up front is in how we address incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people. Words like inmate, convict, prisoner are derogatory. And these are words that the system uses to dehumanize people, right? And so this shift across the criminal justice field, the legal landscape in this country towards person first language. And we've seen this in some other areas of linguistics in our society, right? And then two, with relation to the
Sorry,
idea.
can I interrupt? Can you, just for
Sure.
for my sake, can you, what's the best way to address, what's the best term to use? Or
Yeah, and again, to note, this language is still shifting.
Mhm.
What I tend to say is people who are incarcerated, or incarcerated people, if we're looking for kind of a shorter option, or saying, people who have been incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people.
Okay.
Really important there to categorize people as people and not these other identifiers. And then two, in relation to the discourse around not reducing people to their worst mistakes, I think we have to be really, really explicit in recognizing that there are a set of systemic conditions in this country, what in advocacy circles we tend to refer to as the social determinants of health that structure people's decisions. And my pushback here comes from a place where, I get people sometimes who say, we understand you were young and you made a mistake. And if you sort of just admit to us that you made a mistake and you really didn't know what you're doing, we can accept you. And to me, that is unacceptable, right? I made the decisions I made because in reaction to and in the contents of a certain circumstances that I was living under as a young Black man growing up poor in urban America. We have a whole history of racism and oppression and poverty and lack of access to education and lack of access to housing and to clean water that structures those decisions. That people are poor in this country is not a mistake, right? And so again, we just be really, really intentional in how we speak about things. And third, really, really important point here is that Bard College did not change my life. And education did not change my life. You wake up in the morning, you change your socks, you change your sheets. You don't change your life, right? We are who we are because of who we were. Through an education, through earning the degree that I earned, I was able to change the trajectory of my life. But again, we are who we are because of who we were. In all of those things play into how we speak about individuals, or how the system takes the systemic and societal problems and reduces them down to the level of an individual, right? We don't have a problem with crime in this society. We have a problem with criminals, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a problem with a lack of access to education, X, Y, Z. We have a problem with people, individuals who make mistakes, right? The system doesn't need to change. We need to change individuals, right? Bard College through BPI doesn't come into prisons and change people, right? The college had to change the criteria by which it identified who could be a student in this country, right here in New York, in the prisons that it's in, who is capable of rising to the highest academic standards, right? And so again, about addressing these systems, and I just wanted to take that moment to address them, in language and explicitly, and to call these things out. And so in relation to myself and my personal journey, I'll just say that, I'm from Albany, New York. I grew up in a single parent household. I grew up poor for a number of reasons. I made certain decisions in my life. Some people consider them bad, right? I look back on them now and say, you know, what's a bad decision when the choice is worse? And as a result of not just my decisions, but as a result of the society and the racism that's endemic to this society and the oppression of Black and brown people through mass incarceration and over policing, I ended up in prison one day, right? And even look how I use language there. Like, I just ended up in prison. That's not how it worked, right? I committed a crime. I was taken to court. I was convicted. I was sentenced. And I spent 12 years in prison. And in that 12 years, the prison system, which we like to think is about rehabilitation, didn't do one thing for me. Not one. There's nothing in those 12 years that the prison system offered me that I can utilize in my life today. Bard College did something for me. And the education that I earned through BPI, the Bard College degree that I earned through BPI, allowed me to change the trajectory of my life. And I've been able to walk out of prison and have opportunities unlike those that are usually afforded to, open to other formerly incarcerated people.
Yeah, I think that was well put. That which leads me to sort of my next maybe overarching question, and that's: is there, obviously, Djyuan elaborated a little bit on it, a problem with mass incarceration? Is it an overblown issue, or is it talked about proper in the proper amount? So feel free, whomever wants to jump in.
Please. And, you know, I'll begin by saying that I don't think we can ever talk about this enough. The United States of America constitutes 5% of the global population. It is 25% of the globe's prison population. This country incarcerates people at a rate greater than any other country in the world. And in particular, Black and brown people. So mass incarceration is real and it is pernicious. And for 30, 40 years, those policies have been ravaging Black and brown communities. You know, my colleague Jessica pointed out some of the history of the 1994 crime bill. But when the 1994 crime bill ended Pell eligibility to people in prison, to incarcerated people, that was amounted to about $40 million a year. That same bill allocated $7 billion to prison construction, enough money to fund college and prison for 200 years. And policymakers knew it then, and they knew it today, that if someone got an education in prison, they were the least likeliest demographic of formerly incarcerated people to ever go back to prison. But not only did they not go back to prison, they went back to their communities and became productive, tax-paying, engaged citizens. And so, what we see in the 1994 crime bill, and excuse me, Jessica, just to dig into one of the points you made earlier in relation to mass incarceration, that this is a very, very important moment in the history of mass incarceration, not only because it was Democrats who did this, but because in this, the stripping of Pell from incarcerated people often seems like a footnote, but it's something we have to really, really think about, what it means in relation to this larger system. And what it means is that the state, the government, the federal government at that time, said that we have an interest, as my executive director of BPI, Max Kenner, would say, in your punishment, but not in your future. So despite the rhetoric that we have about prisons being about rehabilitation, what the strip and repel eligibility shows us is that those are surface level talking points, and they unveil the system's real function, and that is to punish people. And not only to punish people, to warehouse people, often for very small offenses, for 5, 10, 15, 10, 20 years, 5, 6 decades. That is mass incarceration. The politics of it, the ugliness of it, the perniciousness of it in this country. And we can't talk about it enough.
Totally agree. And if I can jump in, as a historian who focuses on the history of incarceration and the sort of making and rise of the carceral state, I'd like to both underscore what Djyuan just said, but then also take it a step further in really going back to the history to really think about this sort of the question of putting humans in cages in the first place, right? So the question around, is mass incarceration, how much is mass incarceration really a big issue, and do we actually put too many people in prison, also begs the question, or really underscores a larger question, which is, what are we doing putting humans in cages in the first place? Why do we do that? And should we be doing that at any rate, right? So at the rate question, as Djyuan said, we not only have the highest incarceration rate in the world, but we are incarcerating people at a both globally and historically unprecedented rate, right? And that was not inevitable. We incarcerated people at rates comparable to the rest of the industrialized world up until the 1970s. And actual human historical actors made decisions that led to policy changes that started putting more and more people away for longer periods of time, and created not only globally and historically unprecedented rates of incarceration, but you have to hold that fact in your head simultaneously with the fact, as Djyuan points to, that our incarceration is incredibly geographically concentrated, right? So we're incarcerating entire communities of people who are hyper-policed, hyper-surveyed, who have been disinvested in terms of all kinds of other ways the state could be providing supports and networks. And instead, we have a system, a carceral system, a system of punishment. So that's incredibly geographically concentrated amongst Black and Brown communities, amongst Indigenous communities. And as we've grown this beast, poor white communities as well, right? So this is a huge, this is as I described earlier, we really saw it as the social justice issue of our era in this historical moment. But the question that you're asking, I think, again, takes us back to this question of putting humans in cages in the first place, right? And I think it's worth pointing out that the idea of putting people in cages was a social experiment. And it was a social experiment that came out of a rejection of, thinking about colonial era, the primary ways in which people were punished was corporal or capital punishment, incredibly brutal and violent, and also incredibly random and arbitrary. And people kind of in the Enlightenment moment wanted to imagine a system that was more humane. And we're looking for something that could be predictable, could be standardized, and could have a level of, it could be scaled up or down in response to the kind of law infraction, right? So something that had a measure of kind of just proportion to it, and began to think that if you put people in cells proportionate to whatever the infraction was, not only was that more humane, but much more to the point in the early moments, assumed that that would be a deterrence, and that actually having a sort of rational standardized system where everybody could know that they were going to face a certain kind of, a swift and certain punishment, would, as rational actors, decide to abstain from whatever infraction in the first place. And obviously that didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a whole host of reasons that Djyuan started to suggest to us in thinking about the way that systems work and thinking about the way that power and privilege works, which was true throughout American history for all kinds of groups of marginalized and disenfranchised people, right? And we moved from that to, in rejecting that and understanding that that was a failure, to a Quaker-based theory that with solitude could come repentance, hence the name penitentiary. And so we started to think, okay, maybe we should put human beings in cells in total isolation and solitude as a way for them to repent their sins and become better people. And of course that led to insanity and little else. And then we started work, said, okay, that's barbaric and inhumane too, and started in on an experiment of keeping the cells and thinking maybe through congregate labor, we could get folks to change their ill ways, right? Now, I could go on and on. The point is, every generation, reformers have understood the prison to be a failure and to be inhumane, and somehow reinvest in the notion that people should be in a cage in the first place. And I think we're finally at a moment where questioning that fundamental assumption, which is historically constructed and not natural or inevitable, that the way that we can think about harm between people, for example, should be through a carceral system, should be through putting humans in cages. I think we are finally at a place where, rather than going through this cycle of understanding it to be inhumane and failing and just tweaking the edges, that we are fundamentally, as a society, starting, we're not there by any stretch, but we're starting to have real conversations about what it would look like to move completely away from that as a system, and why there are so many other ways to imagine a society that would have public good, that you know, to question why we think that putting humans in cages is actually good for society is a public good, and really starting to pull that logic apart. And so that's an exciting place to be in this moment where we are, as we've said, in this crisis of incarcerating people globally and historically unprecedented rates.
Yeah, what you just said made me think of what would an alternative world be? Again, because I'm speaking maybe from a position of pure curiosity and ignorance on the subject, because I don't know nearly enough about the about mass incarceration, and so I'm obviously asking the experts here. The way you view, like, society views crime as a whole, is that somebody commits a crime, whatever the crime may be, and then they go to prison, right? Or there's obviously a whole sentencing process and all that. What would a different way be to look at the situation? What would, like, in an ideal world that we can, build, say we don't have any prisons, we start from scratch, what would we do?
Well, you never start from scratch, and Djyuan already alluded to it in talking about systems. Djyuan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
No, please, Jessica. No, really, really good point. We can never start from scratch, but two, systems, right? One, you to recognize that crime is systemically encouraged, and in some cases enabled, right? And so this is not about bad actors. This is not about criminals. This is not even about illegality, right? As you said, most people think someone goes out and commits a crime, they get sentenced, they go to prison, they get rehabilitated. What most people don't think about is that we only criminalize certain populations of people in this country. And as Jessica pointed out, in modern day, these are Black and brown people and increasingly poor white people, right? If you're a Wall Street banker, you can steal hundreds of millions of dollars and get a slap on the wrist. And we call that white collar crime, right? We need a marked category to deal with it, right? We can't even just label that as crime. It has to be white collared crime because we think about it differently and it is treated differently before the law. There's a whole bunch.
Sorry, no,
Go.
you pause
No,
so much. You speak so slowly, which is so good
I'm sorry.
for understanding you and following you, but I keep jumping in thinking you're done. I'm so sorry. No, continue, please.
I'm sorry, Jessica. And so one, I just want to, push people to think beyond crime and think about all the legalities that happen in this society every day that we don't criminalize people for. And so when we are criminalizing people and we are imprisoning people, that is begging the question of why and why those people, right? And so in modern day America, what we see is mass incarceration and felony convictions have been used as a mechanism of voter suppression. Over 5 million Americans, mainly Black and brown, can't vote because they have a felony conviction. 20% of eligible Black voters in Tennessee, as well as Wisconsin, have been felony disenfranchised. Think about the impact of that on elections, especially in a redistricting year, right? What we've seen all across this country is prisons being built in failing farm communities for economic stimulus to create jobs. All the prisons in New York are upstate, and they're not upstate in the middle of nowhere because as some type of safety mechanism, right? We need to get these really, really bad people away from population centers. That's not the case. They've been built to stimulate economies. That's why every time Andrew Cuomo closes a prison, the local representatives come out against it and say, oh, you're going to cost us this many jobs. There's no conversation about public safety, right? And so just trying to push us beyond some of this superficial thinking in relation to stuff that is talked about glibly in popular media every day. Because how people think about crime, criminality, mass incarceration has been radically distorted in the mass media. And so we have to question all of these things really, really fundamentally. Before asking, maybe why people are in prison, we have to ask why people commit crimes. And then we have to ask, what are the circumstances that give rise to crime, right? Then we got to go back and ask, well, what do prisons really do?
Exactly. Yeah. Just to add to that, I think in addition to thinking about the ways that we have criminalized whole communities, it's important to recognize that only a fraction of law breaking is ever addressed through the criminal justice system, right? So we often talk about abolition and people say, well, what are you going to do if you're not addressing all of the law breaking that's happening, right? But for the most part, that is not actually how the system functions now. So we have some communities that are hyper policed and hyper criminalized, but the majority of infractions of the law are not necessarily getting addressed through the criminal justice system. A fraction of arrests end in a conviction, right? So and a fraction of law breaking ends in arrest in the first place, right? So that's one kind of fiction that we all live with that we have to kind of break to start to reimagine another world. And then more fundamentally is exactly what Dylan was getting to at the end, which is it's the question is not what are you going to do tomorrow if you opened up all the prison gates? The question is what kind of world could we dream of living in that totally changed the circumstances, systemic circumstances that play into exactly what Dylan was talking about earlier in the first place. So when we talk about the carceral state, one of the things that that term is referring to is a way of governance well beyond building more prisons and jails and well beyond the laws that put people in prison and jail for long periods of time. The carceral state is a way of governance that is not human-centered and is at its core punitive. And that includes, such that we have a welfare state, such that we have a social services and a social safety network, that those things too are often punitive, right? So reimagining justice, reimagining how communities and individuals repair harm done between people is hand in hand with reimagining what it would mean to live in a society that isn't fundamentally based in white supremacy. What does it mean to live in a society where there's a more equal distribution of resources and access to opportunity, right? So if you start to ask those questions and get to some of the heart of structural inequity, then the question of what we do when there's harm between people could look very different. And so it's a fundamental reimagining of how we live together in society.
Yeah. So I guess the point I was trying to make with the first question, maybe I'm not asking my questions the right way, and maybe I'm not thinking about it on a more fundamental level. But
Stan, I would, if I may, for one second, I think that you are asking the right questions in terms of how people typically approach and think about these issues, right? Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is that we are offering you a different way to approach these questions and think about these questions and get behind these questions. So what Jessica and I are trying to do is reframe the entire question. Mm-hmm. No, so please, be comfortable, and we're here with you.
Thank you. So one of, again, the fundamental points you guys touched on was it starts way before incarceration, and it starts on the maybe neighborhood and community level. Is there something government, whether it be state government, federal government, should do to, I don't know, I'm going to give a few examples: fund public schools better, provide them with better, I don't know, teachers, and I don't know, programs like that on a more grassroots, I guess, level that we should be doing that we're not doing, and to provide the opportunity that you alluded to in your answers before. So is there something government or people can do on their own to provide those opportunities?
Well, I think to bring this back around to a conversation around the value of college and prison, first, just want to recognize that we know historically that populations of people that have been denied access to education have always made the most of a little bit of education. And so this was true of African Americans, during Reconstruction. This was true of Jewish populations right here where I am in New York, whom the Ivy Leagues held a quota, and some of the best colleges were small community colleges in Brooklyn and Queens. And we can go further back, but any population of individuals that denied access to education historically is always, per se, made the most of, right? And so there's many parts to this, but people like to think about these things economically these days. Well, what if I told you this? For every dollar a state invests in college and prison, it saves $5 on reincarceration costs. Over the past 20 years of the Barred Prison Initiative, less than 4% of our students have ever gone back to prison. We can educate our students. We educate our students at an average cost of about $8,000 a year. You know how much it costs to imprison someone in New York? Over $70,000. Do you know what the recidivism rate is in New York?
40%.
40%. 40% versus our 4%. At a huge markup, and you're getting no return on your investment. Mm-hmm. Right here in New York City, it is going to cost New York City $472,000 per person, $472,000 per person this year to jail someone on Rikers Island. It costs $7,000 a year to put someone in CUNY. That's tuition at CUNY for a year. $7,000 to put someone in jail. $472,000. So when we think about why things are the way they are, we have to think about what our priorities are as a society. And this is a society that has prioritized police brutality, mass incarceration, systemic racism in housing, in healthcare over people. So for me, it's never a question of like what we need to do. It's what we can do because the money's there. We just need to reallocate it, right? What we should be doing. And one of the reasons that we're not doing it is because people don't think about these problems in the way that Jessica and I have approached them today. And so I think in getting to a society, like people say, what do we do without the police? What do we do without prisons? I'm like, that's the society I want to live in. I don't want to live in a society where there's prisons and police on every corner and crime. So how do we get there? Well, that means that we have to make investments in the things that keep us safe. And prisons and police are not those things. We spend more money on policing than any other country in the world and have some of the highest crime rates of any first world nation. We've gotten very little in terms of safety from those investments, and have also ruined tens of thousands of lives and destroyed communities.
Yeah, sorry if I interrupted a thought, but so again, if you had the opportunity to reallocate those funds away from prisons and policing, where would they go? I think that's the question I'm trying to get to the bottom of, because
public housing, education. For the money that we spend, for less than what we spend on incarceration in the United States every year, we can make every public college and university in this country tuition free. Mm-hmm. Let's stop incarcerating people. Let's start educating people, right?
And to your point about to your point about public housing, how would you reallocate the money towards building more public housing or making the existing public house? For example, I live in New York as well, in New York City, making, the existing public housing safer and the quality of the buildings better. Is that what you're talking about, or building more public housing?
I think
or
we need to
both?
do both, right? We need to make those investments in infrastructure, but we also need to expand our public housing stock, right? But part of that is that right now, the problem, and the reason we're not doing that, because people find it acceptable to incarcerate an unhoused person for sleeping on the wrong doorstep. So we're going to put that person on Rikers Island for $472,000 a year. We could have got him an apartment, a car, bought his groceries and his clothes for 10 times less than that. This is a completely dysfunctional and irrational system.
Just on that point, it's worth remembering that as lawmakers started to enact mandatory minimums and other laws that were sending more and more people to prison, and New York State's prison population doubled by the 1980s, senior Governor Cuomo, Mario Cuomo, found the need to build more prisons because of the prison population explosion. And people in the state who had been very supportive of punitive laws were totally unwilling to spend their tax dollars on building new prisons. And so where did Cuomo get the funding to build those prisons? He tapped the housing and urban development funds and used HUD funds to build prisons. And so when you think about that kind of reallocation of funding to build prisons, and when you think about the deep disinvestment in public universities in the state of New York and elsewhere across the country, at the same time as we were putting more and more public funds into building prisons, it's not too hard to start to imagine the ways that you could reverse those trends. And I think there's lots of policy people who can get into the weeds of how best to reallocate and where best to invest in communities. And I think what we do at BPI and what alumni of BPI do in their lives and careers is to suggest, through the success of our work, that as we are reimagining the use of public funds and sort of the role of government in the first place, that the optimism that we bring to the work, the fight against the cynicism that's common even amongst practitioners who do reentry and other kinds of programming within the prisons. It's widespread cynicism about what's possible for people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and the work that we do that blows that paradigm away in ways comparable to what we started this conversation with in thinking about the film College Behind Bars. If you start with that optimism and that faith in people and the total transformation that happens with opportunity. So keeping in mind Djyuan's really, really important point that education does not fix broken people, does not transform people in any way that's different from the way that any of us should be transformed after we've read a book, that we should be the same person we are when we open the book, but we're not fixing broken people. And take that kind of optimism of investing in people and in communities, so that we're not creating cynical new mass public housing systems or sort of systems for poor people that may reallocate funds away from prisons, but are still a part of what I was calling the carceral state, right? Are still about sort of othering whole communities of people, and instead start to think about real equity and opportunity. Again, that optimistic vision of the future and of what happens when people who are most directly impacted are in fact the ones making decisions and driving change. Then we'll start to get to a place where freedom has some real meaning behind it.
Yeah. Whenever I promoted this documentary to friends or to people that I know, or whomever, the one very common reaction that I hear giving a free education to prisoners. I'm sorry, Djyuan, I know it's incarcerated people. But that's what people say, right? We're giving free education to prisoners, and that opportunity, a free education, quote unquote, is not afforded to a lot of people that are not in prison, right? That's the main critique. I think it's cynical, obviously, but have you found that to be the main critique of the program? And
no,
or are
you
there
know what
others?
I find that to be the easiest critique of the program, right? And the least thoughtful, because if you're okay with sending people to prison, if you're okay with paying to send people to prison, but have a problem with funding tuition-free public education, it's not about the cost, right? And in that, you're telling me that you really are not concerned with access to education, right? You're primarily focused with the idea and on the idea of punishment, right?
We always have to push back against that zero sum, that education, that's a pie, right? And education for me means less for you, right? That's never been the case.
Yeah. It has never been the case. And we live in a country, we live in a society where there are more prisons and jails than public colleges and universities, right? So if we're going to have that conversation, that economics kind of based conversation, which some people find intelligent and smart, let's really put all of the facts on the table. And I'm going to win that argument every time. I'm going to win it every time. Yeah. But the facts here, as Jessica pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, are not what's at stake, right? We didn't get to or into mass incarceration wasn't constructed based on facts, right? We got here by a policy of anecdote, right? We got here by politicians putting Willie Horton on TV and fear-mongering, right? We got here through stories about welfare queens that were made up. They didn't, like, that person doesn't even exist, right? This is not a system that was built on the facts or concerned about facts. And people's opposition to reforming it, to abolishing it, to defunding it is not rooted in facts, because most people have very little consciousness about crime, criminality, imprisonment, mass incarceration, poverty, public housing. They don't know. They've never researched it. They haven't thought about it. I meet grown people all the time, 30, 40, 50 years old, who have no racialized analysis of American society. But you want to argue with me about some hypothetical situation where educating an incarcerated person is subtracting in some zero-sum way, right, from the education of a law-abiding citizen.
To bring it back to BPI just for a moment, you know, we have always said that the core of what we do has very little to do with prison at all, and is really a critique of failures of institutions of higher education to, as Dyjuan said earlier, imagine where their student body might be drawn from, imagine points of access that have to do less with replicating privilege and more to do with the simple fact that perhaps the only thing that's widely and equally distributed across our society is talent and capacity. And so how do you, so reaching students in places where universities have really failed to engage before. And through that kind of mission, we have expanded beyond prisons to offer tuition-free micro-colleges out in the community. And we've only been doing this for a few years, but it starts to point to a larger vision that also gets to the question that you asked, and that, you know, we do hear from audiences when we do question and answer all the time. And so that vision of that other world where we have invested in people and we have divested in punishment should absolutely include access to affordable education, access to tuition-free education, so that nobody is saying, why can't I go to college too, right? We took money from public institutions of higher education to build prisons. That's part of why someone might think they have the inability to go to college and are looking at college and prison as a zero sum. So those are not mutually exclusive endeavors at all.
Yeah, maybe to begin wrapping up, I do want to end how I started, sort of by thanking you guys for, you know, coming on and speaking about the program and talking about some of the systemic issues that face this country and how we can go about fixing it. But I want to finish off maybe on a more positive note. I asked two questions of every guest that I have on the podcast, and one is, what gives both of you guys hope for the future? And the second one, I asked for 5 books that you guys could recommend to an audience. Again, the books could be fiction, they could be nonfiction, they could be related to mass incarceration, or they can be related to, you know, it could be Moby Dick, right? It doesn't really matter.
You first, Djyuan.
You know, to think about this in terms of, I'm trying to think, you know, what kind of books have I found most useful lately? And I don't know if I'm going to get up to 5, but
As many
there's
as
a
you
great
can.
book. There's a great book by my friend Carl Sudler on the history of juvenile detention and the criminalization of youth in New York City. It's called Presumed Criminal. So I definitely like people to read that. There's another book I think that is fundamental to the modern analysis of mass incarceration. That's The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Alex Vitale has a fantastic book titled The End of Policing. And anyone who's thought for a second about what it means to defund the police and why we should defund the police, or maybe if you're thinking that we shouldn't, you need to read that book. I think that we too often, when we're thinking about crime and criminality and people in this society, we like to trump up and use, you know, fearmonger around what politicians per se will call violent criminals. And there's a fantastic book called Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered that challenges people's ideas in relation to what is a violent criminal, what does that mean, and how do we move towards a society of rehabilitation and reconciliation that deals with and reckons with violent crime. And 5, you know, it's not going to be a book, but everyone should definitely watch College Behind Bars.
Completely agree.
I'm so glad you said Until We Reckon, because that was one of mine, and I was making a list that was getting longer than 5. So my list is designed, and you know, I'm a historian and teacher, so I like to create syllabi, and 5 is so I'm thinking about these in conversation with each other and in conversation with our conversation. So Daniel Karpowitz, who worked for Bard Prison Initiative for a long time, wrote a book called College and Prison, Reading in the Era of Mass Incarceration. And I think that's a good book to really start to think about in a really sort of deep way what we do at BPI and what college and prison is and means. And then to think about spaces to reimagine what we're doing in society in terms of justice and in terms of freedom, in terms of equity. I would start with Fire This Time by James Baldwin, which is it's a book I turn back to again and again and again. I would encourage really anything that Robin D.G. Kelly, historian at UCLA, has written, but in particular, I think about his book Freedom Dreams, which talks about the long legacy of African-American activists and not formal activists, but communities that have dreamt of what freedom could and should look like over time. And then historian Jalili Kohler-Hausman has a book called Getting Tough, which talks about this sort of punitive turn in ways that I think is really important and helpful, because it holds in the same conversation the policy discussions around punishment on the one hand and welfare on the other, and how both of those were racialized in a way that fed into the fury of kind of tough on crime politics. And I think that's really important to understand that. And then a book that very recently came out by a really leading abolitionist, We Do This Till We Free Us, by Maryam Kaba, and I just think that's one of many, many books that are out right now that are that really outline an abolitionist vision of the future, but a really, really crucial voice in that movement to really start to think about, again, that imagining of what's possible.
Great. Thank you to you both. Before we wrap up, can you guys share how people can support BPI if there's, I assume there's a way?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question.
Of course.
And for sure, you know, the thing that makes the work we do and the work programs like us across the country possible is a blend of funding, and you know, the donations that we get from our supporters really makes the work possible, and is often the thing that makes you know, the question of can a college go into a prison and do this kind of work comes down to funding and money almost always. It's not the prison keeping the college out. It's usually not the college resisting at the end of the day. It's funding. So absolutely donations. If you go to bpi.bard.edu, you'll see the links to give. And so that's a fundamental way to really support the work. And beyond that, sharing College Behind Bars as widely as possible, holding viewing parties, encouraging people to watch it, and then following us on social media, and you know, sharing and retweeting and helping lift up the work we're doing to a wider and wider audience is always helpful and appreciated. So what did I miss? You're our guru in this.
No, you hit all the points. I'm good. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you to you both. Best of luck to you, and hope you stay safe.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yep. Have a good one.